As we saw in our last lecture, the events that precipitated the drafting of the Magna Carta had little to nothing to do with protecting the rights of the common man. In 1215, it was 25 angry barons who were fed up with the ineptitude of King John, his religious disputes, his conflicts with France, and his attempt to fund multiple wars simultaneously by constantly levying taxes on his nobles. The nobles drafted the document that has become known to many as the foundation of our modern justice system. On June 15, 1215, at the field of Runnymede outside London, the 25 angry barons met with John, entered into negotiations that later were written down and to which John would later attach his royal seal. This is an important point because while John could read, it's not clear if he could write. Those two skills were learned separately, if at all, in the Middle Ages. So he did not sign anything. Rather, he attached his royal seal, which was pressed into a beeswax mixture that was then affixed to the document. 4 days later, on June 19th, the barons renewed their oaths of allegiance to John, and copies of the Magna Carta were distributed to various places throughout England. This brings us to a few important points about the physical document itself. Today, 4 copies survive, each written in the hand of a different scribe, so they look different, even though they contain the same information. One is in Salisbury Cathedral, one is owned by Lincoln Cathedral, and 2 are in the British Library. There is no original document. In other words, one of these documents is not more Magna Carta-ish than the others, because once the terms were agreed upon, several scribes set to work at once, copying down the clauses. Another important point, this document was written in Latin, not English. In 1215, Latin was the language of government, bureaucracy, and the learned elite. All church officials throughout the medieval world knew Latin. What this meant was that at important church councils, people whose native languages were German or French or English or some other language or dialect of one of those could all communicate easily with one another in Latin. Indeed, much of the business of the Catholic Church today is conducted in Latin. I have even been told that in Vatican City, which is home to church officials who hail from all over the world, there is an ATM that, like many ATMs, offers different language options, and one of those, I'm told, is Latin. It appears that the first issuance of the written document we call Magna Carta was in the form of 7 copies that were distributed throughout the kingdom on June 24th, 1215. A few more went out a little bit later. Some scholars think that there may have been 13 copies of the Magna Carta shortly after that day in June 1215. But as we saw in our last lecture, just 10 weeks after the charter went into effect, John persuaded the Pope to declare it null and void. In our next lecture, we'll talk about how it was that Magna Carta managed to survive, be reissued over the centuries, and become the revered document that it is today. But in this lecture, let's do something that not a lot of people do. Let's look at the Magna Carta in detail. In its final form, this document contained 63 clauses. We briefly discussed some of those clauses in our last lecture, especially those that took issue with how John was trying to manipulate the remarriage of widows and the control of minor heirs to great estates to his own advantage. We also discussed the matter of scutage, which was the money that John was entitled to demand from his nobles when he needed it to fund important endeavors. And of course, most people who know anything about what the Magna Carta contains are most familiar with what's in the middle of the charter, clauses 38, 39, and 40. Clause 38 reads, quote, "In future, no official shall place a man on trial upon his own unsupported statement without producing credible witnesses to the truth of it." 39 reads, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land." Number 40 is, "To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice." Read from a modern vantage point, these three clauses seem to be articulating the right to trial by jury, the right to due process and proper legal procedure, and there are many who have read it that way. But what it meant at the time was that none of John's nobles should have to put up with his bad decisions unless a group of them got together and said it was okay, just as a group of 25 of them had gotten together to issue the king their ultimatum. What dilutes the supposed power of these clauses still further is that not only are they not at the beginning of the document, they're not even the dramatic climax. After the bit about never denying or delaying justice, the Magna Carta moves its focus to merchants moving in and out of the country, discussion of who has the right to do what in the forest, not allowing women to bring criminal charges against anyone, how and if the crusading movement should continue, and what to do about those pesky Welsh causing trouble in the west and the Scots in the north, and removing from office anyone related to or a friend of some guy named Gerard of Athay, who apparently was not very popular. There are also several mentions of Jews, an indicator of the rise of a persecuting society that we start to see more and more starting in the 12th century, and which we'll discuss at much greater length in later lectures. One thing that is so fascinating about the Magna Carta is how it can be at sometimes so specific and at others so vague. Clause 13, for example, states that, quote, "The city of London shall enjoy all its ancient liberties and free customs, both by land and by water. We also will and grant that all other cities, boroughs, towns, and ports shall enjoy all their liberties and free customs," end quote. Nowhere does it specify what these so-called ancient liberties and free customs might be, or who gets to determine what they are, or arranges to make sure they are enforced, or what the penalty will be for disregarding this clause, or how disregard is even to be measured. By contrast, matters of inheritance are spelled out down to the shilling. Clause 2 states that when a nobleman of the rank of earl dies, his heirs shall pay 100 pounds for the right to succeed to their inheritance. In the case of the heirs of a knight, the inheritance tax is to be 100 shillings. Clause 3 follows up by affirming that for heirs that are under age, no payment or relief will be demanded by the crown. You may be asking, if the inheritance issue is number 2, and number 3, it's also addressed in clauses 4 and 5, then what is number 1? What was the first thing, the most important thing in the minds of the barons? For those of us living in the modern world, the answer might surprise you, but for the medieval world, it made complete sense. The topic of clause 1 is the church. This clause is actually more preamble than clause, which is further evidence of just how important the matter of the church's freedom was in the minds of those who forced John to accept the Magna Carta. Written as if the words are being spoken by John himself, this first clause, which follows a list of those present as witnesses to these negotiations, reads as follows, quote, "First, that we have granted to God and by this present charter have confirmed for us and our heirs in perpetuity that the English church shall be free and shall have its rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired. That we wish this so to be observed appeared from the fact that of our own free will, before the outbreak of the present dispute between us and our barons, we granted and confirmed by charter the freedom of the Church's elections, a right reckoned to be of the greatest necessity and importance to it, and caused this to be confirmed by Pope Innocent III. This freedom we shall observe ourselves, and desire to be observed in good faith by our heirs in perpetuity. To all free men of our kingdom, we have also granted, for us and our heirs forever, all the liberties written out below, to have and to keep for them and their heirs of us and our heirs." End quote. From here, the document begins to wrestle with matters of inheritance, as I mentioned a moment ago, and then onto the related issue of the rights of widows, when they should receive their dower or the property they brought with them to the marriage after the death of a husband, and then this gem in Clause 8. "No widow shall be compelled to marry so long as she wishes to remain without a husband, but she must give security that she will not marry without royal consent if she holds her lands of the crown or without the consent of whatever other lord she may hold them of." All right, so what's behind this? Well, if you were a woman in the 13th century, virtually the only time you had power over your own affairs was if you were a widow. This was also the only time that a woman could own and control her own property. There were a few exceptions to this, but in general, this is kind of the basic situation. Now, if a widow remarried, if she was an heiress with a lot of lands, who got control of those lands? Her new husband. You might see where this is going. A widow with a sizable estate would have any number of suitors eager to snap her up, along with her lands, the rents they brought in, etc., etc. Recognizing this as an opportunity to make some cash, John had started compelling widows to remarry, usually against their will, to whatever nobleman was the highest bidder and willing to pay the crown the greatest sum of money. He'd been doing the same thing with minor heirs to major estates. If a 12-year-old inherited lands and titles, a guardian would need to be appointed until that heir reached the age of majority. John had been selling these guardianships, once again, to the highest bidder. And very often these people did not have the heir's best interests at heart, but were more interested in exploiting the inheritance as much as they could, as quickly as they could, before the heir came of age and could make decisions for himself. So you have some cases where the logical person to be named guardian, say an uncle or cousin, who would presumably act in the heir's best interests, would be passed over for someone who just wanted access to the lands and estates that were close to his own, thereby creating one larger, much more profitable holding for at least as long as the minor was a minor. Similarly, Clause 12 deals with scutage, or what feudal tenants owed the king instead of military service. "No scutage or aid may be levied in our kingdom without its general consent, unless it is for the ransom of our person, to make our eldest son a knight, and once to marry our eldest daughter. For these purposes only, a reasonable aid may be levied." So, in a feudal society, when a knight became a vassal of the king, one thing he pledged was to be ready to serve a certain number of days of military service if the king needed it. This could get tricky if, say, for example, you're ready to go to war, you called your vassals to get ready to fight, and then the weather prevented you from sailing across the channel for a few weeks. Those weeks spent waiting counted toward the days of military service. And guess what? If the weather hadn't turned by the time the allotted days were up, the nobles were well within their rights to say, "Well, I've given you my days, I've got to leave now and get back to my estate." By the 13th century, very often, instead of days of service, cash payment was preferred. This way, the king could pay mercenaries, who were often better fighters than his vassals, who spent most of their days overseeing their estates, and he had more control over how long they would serve him. As long as they were getting paid, they would stay on the job. Now, before 1215, there was no hard and fast rule about when these scutages or aids could be levied. Basically, it was whenever the king felt he needed it. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, John levied 11 in his 17 years on the throne. His father had demanded only 8 in 34 years. So you can see why the barons said enough and decided to put some limits on when and for what John could levy these aids. I would have to say that some of my favorite sections of the Magna Carta are those that give us a hint of what I like to call medieval shenanigans, but which we don't always get the full story on. In some cases, it's like reading a joke to which the punchline has been lost. Here, for example, is Clause 23. Quote, "No town or person shall be forced to build bridges over rivers except those with an ancient obligation to do so," end quote. Well, it had always been the case that roadways and bridges needed to be maintained for the good of the Commonwealth, and certain communities were obliged to maintain their bridges and roads. John took this a step too far, apparently. John loved the sport of falconry, and when he would ride out to fly his birds, he needed to be able to track them. If there was a river in the way and he had to take a long detour to get across it, he apparently got very cranky. So he started ordering towns and individual lords to build more bridges for his own convenience. Or then there's Clause 31, which states, quote, "Neither we nor any royal official will take wood for our castle or for any other purpose without the consent of the owner." And then there's Clause 33. "All fish weirs shall be removed from the Thames, the Medway, and throughout the whole of England, except on the seacoast." As I mentioned in our last lecture, this clause was because ships and boats on the Thames, a very important trade route, were regularly being damaged by colliding with these fish weirs, which were difficult, if not impossible, to see. Clause 35 suggests widespread, what we might call short pouring, when it affirms that, quote, "There shall be standard measures of wine, ale, and corn," the London Quarter, "throughout the kingdom. There shall also be a standard width of dyed cloth, russet, and haberject, namely 2 ells within the selvages. Weights are to be standardized similarly." Now, what's happening here is that sellers of cloth were notorious for stretching the cloth. A selvage, which is really just the compound word self-edge, is the border of the cloth that was finished or stitched in such a way as to keep the cloth from unraveling. So yes, what you're thinking is right. First, we've got to deal with firewood theft, fish traps that are cluttering up the Thames and damaging the boats of wealthy merchants who want to do business. We got to make sure that a pint of ale is the same size from one end of England to the other. We got to stop arbitrary bridge building. Then, and only then, can we focus on what today we would call matters of justice and human rights. Apart from these clauses that we might call general and that they deal with everyday life in the kingdom, there are clauses that deal with specific political crises in play at that very moment. Clauses 56 to 59 deal with some problematic issues relating to Wales and Scotland. Now, many of you know the relationship of Wales to England is a complicated one, then and now, and the Magna Carta deals with a tricky legal reality that existed at this time. It spells out when a Welsh person or an English person should be subject to either English law, Welsh law, or the law of the Marches. Many of you may be aware of the fact that there were distinct differences between the Welsh and English legal systems, but some of you may be wondering about this reference to the Marches. The Marches are the lands between England and Wales, and the territories therein were held by nobles known as the Marcher Lords. And Marcher law was its own thing, different from English law, different from Welsh law, but bearing affinities with each in some areas. The Marcher Lords were, to a certain extent, independent of both England and Wales, and this was a situation that lasted until the 16th century, when the last of the Marcher holdings passed into the hands of the crown. It is not until this point, really, that we can begin to speak of a pervasive English common law, which supposedly originated several centuries before in Magna Carta. Another interesting thing to note here, Clause 58 states, "We will at once return the son of Llewellyn, all Welsh hostages, and the Carters delivered to us as security for the peace." John had been working to add Wales, finally, to England. To further this, he had married his illegitimate daughter, Joanna, or Joan, to Llewellyn the Great, who was a prince of North Wales. Joan would act as an important negotiator between her father and husband, and later, her husband and her half-brother, Henry III. Despite Joan's best efforts, tensions remained high between Wales and England. In order to secure a peace, Llewellyn had sent his illegitimate son, Griffith, to England in 1211, where he would live under a form of house arrest. It's no surprise that Llewellyn then allied himself with the 25 barons who forced John to accept the Magna Carta, and that because he did so, the freeing of his son would be one of the conditions of that document. John was not only holding Welsh hostages, however. He'd been having some trouble with Scotland. You might say that today, as far as that goes, everything old is new again, given the referendum on Scottish independence and the Brexit controversy. Clause 59 reads, quote, "With regard to the return of the sisters and hostages of Alexander, King of Scotland, his liberties and his rights, we will treat him in the same way as our other barons of England," end quote. Like Wales, Scotland had long been at odds with the English crown over its independence and rights. And in 1174, after a defeat in battle, the King of Scotland agreed that he would hold his territories as fiefs of the English crown and pledged as much to Henry II. Richard I, John's brother and Henry's son, had essentially sold back the right of Scottish sovereignty in 1190 when he needed to raise money to go on crusade. When John came to the throne, he insisted that the Scots do homage to the English crown again, and a fierce and often violent debate ensued. As with Wales, John insisted on hostages to secure the peace, and King William of Scotland reluctantly sent his daughters Margaret and Isabel to become wards of John, with the understanding that John could marry them off, and presumably one of those marriages would be to John's son, a union that would then unite these two regions of Britain. But when the barons began to push back against John, Alexander, the new king of Scotland, allied himself with the 25 and included the demand that his sisters be returned to him. But when it comes to specific people, this one is my favorite. It's Clause 50. Quote, "We will remove completely from their offices the kinsmen of Gerhard de Athay, and in future they shall hold no offices in England. The people in question are Engelard de Sigonier, Peter, Guy, and Andrew de Chanceau, Guy de Sigonier, Geoffrey de Martigny, and his brothers Philip, Mark, and his brothers, with Geoffrey his nephew, and all their followers." This raises the question, what kind of jerks were Gerhard de Athay and his buddies, and what did they do that was so terrible they were singled out like this? Well, you'll recall that when John came to the throne, England had substantial holdings in what is today France. But during his reign, the three villages of Athay, Sigonier, and Chanceau were lost to French control. These men, who were natives of these territories, decided when this happened that they would cross the Channel and come to England, for indeed they considered themselves English subjects. So the situation here is that you have a group of foreigners from out of town who show up en masse, more loyal to each other than to the English subjects living in Britain, and who were all experienced warriors. John gave many of them important offices, particularly as sheriffs of wealthy and extensive areas. This did not set well with locals who, as you might imagine, got their backs up when some guys from out of town with accents showed up and started bossing them around. Other clauses in the Magna Carta address the fact that sheriffs were taking bribes, extorting the citizens of their territories, and generally being all-around bad guys. The Sheriff of Nottingham in the Robin Hood stories is the perfect example of this kind of villainy. And it seems clear that Gérard de Vathey and his compatriots were regularly engaging in this behavior. It must have been pretty bad if the barons not only gave specific orders about the behavior of sheriffs, but then took the extra step of singling out this group in particular for censure. We, alas, don't have time to explore every clause of the Magna Carta, but I think those we've examined today give us a fascinating look into the grievances, large and small, which drove the barons to make these demands of the king. And toward the end of the document, there is a long explanation of the need for there to always be 25 barons who will make sure the king obeys and enforces Magna Carta, what to do if there is disagreement among the barons, and what the process should be for replacement should one of their number die. Clause 61 concludes with, "The 25 barons shall swear to obey all the above articles faithfully, and shall cause them to be obeyed by others to the best of their power." Amidst the clauses that arguably gave rise to great advances in human rights, or that simply provide a fascinating window onto what quotidian medieval society was like, there are clauses that give one pause, that are sobering, because from our vantage point in the 21st century, we know what atrocities and horrors they seem to foretell. Clauses 10 and 11 of the Magna Carta specifically address what happens in cases when Christians who owe money to Jews die before the debt is repaid. The Magna Carta states that if this should happen, at the very least, no interest need ever be paid on the loan, and in some cases, the loan simply disappears. This is just a small glimpse of the concern with the status and roles played by the Jews in medieval society that would resurface repeatedly in the decades to follow, and would do so in uglier and more horrifying ways. This issue is one that would be addressed by several of the canons of another big event in 1215, the meeting of the Fourth Lateran Council. Although few people today could tell you what was important about the Fourth Lateran Council, in the medieval world, everyone was impacted by the decisions that were made there and the canons that resulted from its meeting. As we'll see in a later lecture, this other major event in 1215 dramatically impacted the church at all levels, from the highest-ranking bishop down to the lowliest parishioner, and its influence would be felt across cultures, space, and time, with repercussions into the modern era. So too would Magna Carta be an event whose impact is felt down to the present day. But at the time when it was accepted by John, it really was only a big deal to John and the 25 barons. In fact, it wasn't even called the Magna Carta then. Those of you who know Latin know that those words mean Great Charter, and many people are under the impression that it is called that because the words it contains are so powerful, so important, so historic. No. It gets called the Great Charter after the clauses concerning forests are pulled out and put into a separate charter known as the Forest Charter. The document we're discussing was called Great simply because it was longer, it was bigger, greater than the Forest Charter. It was a way of keeping track of which charter was which, nothing more. In our next lecture, we're going to explore the aftermath of that day at Runnymede in 1215 and see how the Magna Carta, down through the centuries, has grown into its designation as a work that is great in more ways than one.